Hello, everyone. This is Jeanette Schliega with VGA, and I am here with the wonderful and amazing Melissa Barker, and she's going to be sharing a presentation to help us celebrate VGA's 4th birthday. And the presentation she is going to be sharing is called Moonshine and Stills, Finding Archived Records for Your Moonshiner Ancestor. Melissa, thank you so much for doing this for VGA, and the time is all yours.
Well, thank you, Jeanette, and happy birthday to VGA. How fantastic that is. I've been there since the beginning. It's a fantastic group, and they bring some great genealogy educational materials to everyone. But this time we're going to talk about moonshine. I actually came up with this presentation because I work in an archive. I'm known as the archive lady in the genealogy world. I'm a certified archives manager. I work in the Houston County, Tennessee Archives and Museum. I'm also a professional genealogist, but working in my archives over the last few years, I have somehow started collecting moonshine records and photographs. And so I thought, this would make a great presentation. So let's talk about moonshine and your ancestors. And I want you to keep in mind, if you think you don't have moonshine ancestors, or that you think you don't live in an area or your ancestors didn't live in an area where they may have had moonshine, think again. We're going to show you some ways that you may just find that out. So one of our previous presidents and also a Tennessean, Andrew Jackson, gave a quote. He said, "I never saw a Kentuckian who didn't have a gun, a pack of cards, and a jug of whiskey." So moonshine, whiskey, and alcohol have been part of our society forever. And so one of the things I like to talk about when we talk about any kind of records, any kind of subject matter when it comes to genealogy is archives. Any of you that have seen my presentations, you know that I am a huge proponent of archives, and that I find that genealogists may not know exactly what an archive is, what repositories are considered archives, because a lot of times these places don't have the name archive on the building or archive in their name. So let's talk about a few things of what could be an archive. First and foremost, let's talk about a definition of an archive. The Society of American Archivists defines an archive as an organization that collects the records of individuals, families, and other organizations. Now, this is a pretty broad definition, but you can see how it will incorporate just about any kind of records. If you find a building that has records in it that they're collecting, preserving, it's some sort of an archive. So archives are literally everywhere. And thank goodness for us as genealogists that they are, because they help us to find records for our ancestors. So I'm going to run through a few types of archives before we get to those moonshine records. One of the most popular archives out there are county archives. That's what I work for. I work for a county archive. They're usually part of the county government. They contain county government records, but many of them also collect historical and genealogical records, and they are great resources for genealogists. Another type of archive are historical and genealogical societies. If they have a building with records in them, they are a type of archive. So don't forget to check for those historical and genealogical societies in the area where your ancestors lived, because they are continually every day doing the work of preserving records, collecting history, and telling those stories and helping genealogists too. Local public libraries, they are also a type of archive. Like I said, they may not have archive in their name, but they could have archived records or genealogical records. They could have a whole room that is a genealogy room that contains records, or maybe they just have a few shelf of genealogical reference books. But they could also have things like special collections, loose papers, scrapbooks, diaries, old letters. So don't forget the local public library as a place to do research for your ancestors in genealogical and archived records. And state archives. I love state archives. I call them mega archives because they have just so many records. They do try to collect records from across the entire state of whatever state they represent. And in my case, this is the Tennessee State Library and Archives photograph from 1953. That's about the time that this building was built. Today, we have a brand new Tennessee State Library and Archives that was just opened a year ago. We're very excited about that. But these types of archives hold tremendous amount of records. I've notified the red arrows at the top of this building. When I was attending the Archives Institute to become an archivist here at this building, they asked us if we would like to see a tour of the Supreme Court records, the Tennessee Supreme Court records. And of course we wanted to. So we get on the elevator, we go to the top of this building, the top floor, we step out, and as far as our eye could see was nothing but shelves and boxes full of records. And it was the Tennessee Supreme Court records. It was made quite an impact on me, showing me how these buildings are just filled with records. Another type of archive are archives and libraries on university and college campuses. Many of you may think that you don't need to be going to do research there because they have records that are about the college or the university. My ancestors didn't go to school there, so why would I do research there? Many of these colleges, universities, libraries, and archives have local historical records, and they may even have genealogical records. Many of them have their local newspapers on microfilm for you to look at. Many of them have local diaries, scrapbooks, old letters, things that are from the locals that were donated to them. And why would they be there? Well, maybe it's because there's no place else for them to have gone. So many of our universities and college libraries and archives are filled with genealogical records, and we should be using them. Museums. Museums are also another type of archive. I actually came late to the idea of using museums as an archive or someplace I could find genealogy records for my ancestor. Museums, I like to say, have a front room and a back room. The front room is where you see all the exhibits and displays, kind of like this one. This is actually one of my absolute favorite displays. This is at the Williamson County, Tennessee Museum and Archives. As you can see, they've put together some fantastic exhibits. But they also have back rooms, and in those back rooms, they look exactly like archives back rooms. They have shelves with boxes with records in them. Have you ever been to a museum and you saw an old Civil War letter on display? Well, you know what? There's probably more where that came from in those back rooms. They have photographs, they have documents, they have things that maybe your ancestors are listed in. So use museums as a research resource. Now, I will tell you that sometimes it's a little bit harder to gain access to their records. Museum curators are really protective of them. But if you develop a relationship with a local museum and you talk to them, show them how serious you are about your research, they may let you look at a lot of the things that they have in their back rooms. So put museums on your to-do list and check them out in those areas where your ancestors lived. Church archives. These are phenomenal places to find information about our ancestors. They're normally denominational or the type of religion. Now, in this case, this photograph is from the Historical Foundation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Cordova, Tennessee, which is just outside of Memphis. And Susan Knight Gore is the archivist there, and she does a phenomenal job. So if your ancestors are Cumberland Presbyterian, then you would want to check with this archive. Now you think to yourself, but my ancestors, I don't have any ancestors in Tennessee. This archive is in Tennessee. Well, I can tell you that Susan actually travels from state to state to state to all of the Cumberland Presbyterian churches, gathers up any of the records they want to donate or send to the archive, and then she brings them back to this archive. So the fact that it's in Tennessee, don't let that deter you. If you have ancestors that are part of this particular denomination, you really need to be doing research at this church archives. And there's all kinds of church archives out there. Regional archives, we have many of these out there as well. Regional archives are those kind of archives that are going to talk to you about a particular region on the globe. So in this case, this is the archives of the Appalachia, and the Appalachia encompasses more than one state in the United States. So if your ancestors came from the Appalachian region, this is an archive you want to be looking at. It's actually located at the East Tennessee State University, and they have phenomenal records, but not only records about individuals, but they have records to tell you and to teach you about the culture of these regions. And I don't know about you, but I love to learn anything I can about my ancestors, about where they lived, the culture that they lived in. It helps me to understand my ancestors much better. Ethnic archives. There are all kinds of ethnic archives out there, and many of us have different ethnicities within our ancestry. One of those may be Cherokee Indian. What if you have Cherokee Indian in your ancestry? So there is the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina. Fantastic ethnic archive out there. Another ethnic archive, which is actually one of our newest here in the United States, is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is located in Washington, D.C. I've not had the privilege to go to this archive, but I have heard that it is absolutely phenomenal. So if you have African American history in your ancestry, please go to this archive or get on their website or their social media pages and look to see what they have. They have records, and they're also sort of like a museum. You can walk through, they have exhibits and displays, but they have records. And so if you're researching that aspect of your ancestry, reach out to these ethnic archives. So records can actually literally be anywhere. I like to say there's an archive for everything out there. And when you go to a building or a place where there are records, it's an archive. They are trying to preserve them, they're organizing them, making them available to researchers, and we should be looking for them. Now, I'm the kind of person that says that not everything is online, but there's a lot of records that are coming online every day. I would encourage you to reach out to these archives. If you aren't able to travel, you know, that's really not a huge problem much anymore. You can actually contact them by email, by telephone, maybe even contact them through their social media pages. They are really willing and able to share the records that they have with you. There may be a small percentage of records you may have to actually go see, but for the most part, you may be able to do your research from a distance by just talking with them, developing a relationship with those archives. So let's talk about those moonshining ancestors. You're going to be finding those moonshining ancestors in all of these archives that I've talked about. So you may have them in your family and not even know it. It's not like that our ancestors that were into moonshining actually held out a shingle that said, hey, I'm a moonshiner. So you may have them in your family and not even know it. But if you do have them, don't be afraid to tell their story. It's all part of their history. I have a lot of ancestors that have done some things in the past that were not exactly above board, but I've located that information, I've documented that information, and it actually helps to tell my ancestor story. It tells me why they did what they did, and it also helps me to understand our descendants and why they are the way they are and where they went the way they went. So all of these little things, pieces and parts of your ancestry's history, it helps to tell the entire story. It may not be easy to uncover the information, but that should not deter you. You should still look for these records. You should still seek out and explore the stories that you've maybe heard from your family, just to see if you can prove them and help to tell your ancestor story. I'm always the type of person that anything I can add to birth, marriage, and death information will help to tell my ancestor story. To me, I want to know what my ancestors had for breakfast. I want to know their hobbies. And yes, I even want to know if they were moonshining ancestors. Getting all that information and adding it to my ancestors' life story helps me to bring them to life to me. I like to say that there's no such thing as a boring ancestor because there's always something to find to help us tell their story. If you think that because your ancestors lived in the city, that there's no way that they would be moonshining ancestors, well, you might be wrong on that. Here's an example. This is some photographs of some people in an apartment in Los Angeles, California, making moonshine in the city. This is actually from the 1930s. And they found these stills and this moonshining equipment in an apartment in Los Angeles, California. This actually comes from the U.S. National Archives photo collection. And so if you think your ancestors were living in the city and that they would have nothing to do with sort of thing, you may want to think again. You know, we need to look at every aspect of our ancestors' lives. We don't need to think that they would never have done something. Maybe they did, and maybe we just didn't know about it. Do you think moonshining is just for men? Well, you might want to think that one again as well, because women were into it as well. This is another photograph. This one is from the West Virginia State Archives photo collection. And these two women were arrested for making moonshine in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1921. As you can see, they've got their garb on. They've even got some weapons there. They were into moonshining and they were women. So the moonshining was not just for men, and so women were in on the game as well. So many of us are looking for information about our female ancestors. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to find. And so as you're looking for that information, you're going to look in all the records I'm going to show you here in just a minute. You may find some of your female ancestors got into the moonshining game as well. Here's another example. This is a newspaper article from Chronicling America out of San Francisco, California, dated May 21st, 1896. So you think about moonshining only during the Prohibition period, but it was happening all the time. And so it says, women as whitecaps, female vigilantes in Kentucky wreck a moonshine still. Well, when you look at the definition of a whitecap from that time, it is defined as a violent, lawless movement. Women were into a lot of things that we don't give them credit for. And so we need to be looking for these kinds of things to document our female ancestors' lives. So a lot of people tell me, well, moonshining is just a Southern thing, isn't it? Well, not necessarily. I think the South is known for moonshine, but I can tell you that it's not just a Southern thing. The origin of the term moonshine has been around since the 15th century. Have you ever thought of that? How long ago it came from? But it was first used to refer to liquor in the 18th century in where? England, of all places. So no, it's not just a Southern thing. The American roots and the practice of modern American whiskey production in general have their roots in frontier life in Pennsylvania. Well, Pennsylvania is not a Southern state, and other grain producing states, which makes sense because moonshine is made from different grains. The term moonshine comes from the fact that illegal spirits were made under the light of the moon. And so that's where we kind of get our name moonshine. So if you ever want to do a history of moonshine, it is very, very interesting and something that you might want to look into. And actually moonshine running has inspired the NASCAR racing circuit. As many of you may or may not know about NASCAR, or maybe fans, maybe you have other members of your family that are fans of NASCAR, but it inspired NASCAR. That's how NASCAR got started, was from moonshine running. Here's a photograph. This is Georgia moonshine runner Lightning Lloyd C. as he makes a turn in the 1939 Silver Bullet Ford at Daytona Beach in 1941. This photo is courtesy of the Atlanta Constitution newspaper. And NASCAR was started by the fact that moonshiners were driving very, very fast to get away from the authorities, and NASCAR was born. So moonshine, prohibition, and the law. Now, I am no lawyer. I'm not Judy Russell either. But one of the first steps to researching your ancestors and their moonshine history is knowing and understanding the laws surrounding that practice. And so as you do your genealogy research, it's also important to research laws and things surrounding whatever it is you're researching so you can understand it better. The laws could have been why your ancestors delved into moonshining. Many times the laws was what pushed our ancestors into doing what they did, whether it's moonshining or something else. So it's important for us to understand our ancestors' times, what they were faced with, and the decisions that they had to make. Prohibition lasted from January the 17th, 1920 to December the 5th, 1933. So that was a long time, a whole 13 years to go without liquor. And it was during this time when a lot of our ancestors would have started delving into moonshining. So check the laws at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, because they'll all be different. And so you'll need to check what the laws were and if that affected your ancestor. It will take some research and some time and some effort, but I think you'll find it that is well worth the effort to go through with it, because if you do find moonshining ancestors, you'll be able to understand why they did what they did, maybe because of some certain laws that were in their particular area that it kind of drove them to do these certain things. Maybe they did it purely for the financial aspect of it. Many of our ancestors were at points and times in their lives where they needed financial help, and they may have turned to something that wasn't necessarily lawful, but it helped to pay the bills. I would encourage you to go to Family Tree webinars and watch Judy Russell's From the 18th to the 21st, The Records of Prohibition. She does an excellent job of explaining Prohibition and how it can affect your ancestors and the alcohol production in the United States. So I would encourage you to do that. Obvious, especially if they got caught. Sheriff and jail records, we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about oral histories or local histories, local lore. Those maybe are a little more difficult to find, but they can be out there. Newspapers. Newspapers is by far one of the best resources when you're looking for this type of information. So let's start with court records. I work with court records almost every day in the archives because they are a huge part of our collections. Like I said, I work for a county government, and part of our county government are the courts. So I do a lot with the court records, and I've seen a lot of moonshine court records. So moonshine offenses were usually heard in the criminal court. And so you'll need to look in the criminal court cases for any records if you want to look for your ancestor. You'll want to look for particular wording, lingo for moonshining and liquor. A lot of times they didn't use the word moonshine in the records. They used legal lingo, and you'll need to bone up a little bit on that, but it's easy to look up. So some of the lingo that may be used is something called bone dry, which I'll explain here in a minute. Tippling is another term that was used. White lightning to refer to moonshine. Mountain dew was used to refer to moonshine, and firewater. Now, those last three you may even seen in the newspaper when it's reported, but the first two are actually legal terms that you might see on a court record. You want to look for cases in those bound criminal minute books, court minute books. But don't leave it just to the minute books. Once you find something in a minute book, in a bound book, you want to start looking for loose papers. Here's actually a photograph of one of those bound books. This is the Houston County, Tennessee Circuit Court Criminal bound volume from 1871 to 1888. This is in our archives. This book right here has a lot of criminal records in it, entries for criminal things such as moonshining. Here's an example out of that book. Actually, this is from the Houston County, Tennessee Bound Circuit Court Criminal Minute Book, Volume 12, page 411. This is State of Tennessee versus Clayton Spears, November 1944. And he was brought up on charges of possession. He was in possession of alcohol. It says, possesses intoxicating liquors, contrary to the statutes and against the peace and dignity of the state. And so if your ancestor is Mr. Clayton Spears, you have found something in the bound volumes that shows he was possessing of liquor. You also want to look for those loose criminal court records, or maybe they're called court packets. What are these? These are going to be extra documents or accompanying documents to what you find in the bound volumes. They're going to be things like affidavits and subpoenas and witness statements, things like that. It's going to be more information to add to what you find in the minute books. Remember, the information that you find in any kind of a minute book is only one small piece of the puzzle. You need to look for any loose or extra paperwork that helps you to tell the rest of the story. So here is one from the loose papers for Mr. Clayton Spears from September 3rd, 1944. It says here that he was unlawfully possessing more than a gallon of intoxicating liquor. Now, I've got a red arrow there pointing to Albert G. Patterson. He was actually the sheriff at the time. And I want you to remember that name, because in a minute, you're going to actually see Mr. Patterson. But he was a well-known sheriff in our area. And so you see his name on a lot of documents, but you're going to see him here in a photograph in just a minute. This is another loose paper. This one is actually State versus Herschel Cook. Now, remember me talking to you about that lingo, that moonshine lingo. Well, here's one of those. The charge on this is bone dry. This is from the Houston County Loose Circuit Court records from July of 1924. So what is bone dry? Well, bone dry was a law, and it stipulated that it shall be unlawful for any person to possess any liquor, directly or indirectly, from a common or other carrier. That's from the Tennessee Code annotated definition. So when you see bone dry, don't let that confuse you. Look up what it means, but this has to do with liquor and moonshining. So next we're going to talk about sheriff and jail records. These may or may not exist, but just because they may or may not exist doesn't mean you shouldn't look for them. It all depends if they survive, if they were saved, if they were preserved. But if they are, then they can be fantastic records to help you tell your ancestor story. So ask about sheriff and county police arrest records, case files, things like that at the local archive, whether that is a county archive, the historical society, the local museum. Ask if they have these records. They may still be located at the courthouse or at the sheriff or jail house. A lot of times these records, even if they're very old, have not been transferred to any kind of an archive. So one of the things we have to do is we have to do the legwork to try to find where the records are located. Also ask about mug books. Many of these still survive, and they survive back to even the 1920s and 30s. Ask for mug books. And what are mug books? Those are where they took their mugshot, their photograph, and put down some pertinent information about them. Maybe, believe it or not, you're searching for that photograph of your ancestor. You may find it in a mug book. How cool would that be? Here's an example of that. This is John Haskins' mugshot from Portland, Oregon from 1923. There he is with his hat on, and you can see that he was brought up on charges violation of the Prohibition law, and he had 2 stills and a great amount of moonshine. And so they even put that on his little card. But if this was your ancestor and you didn't have a photograph of him, what a great way to get a photograph of your ancestor. So look for those mug books. You may just get lucky. Also, don't forget that there may be city police arrest records or case files or mug books. Many times our jurisdictions are set up by county police or sheriff, and then you even have a city police or sheriff. So look at every aspect in a particular area where these records would be located. Also, don't forget, and a lot of times they were brought up on federal charges, which would be not in the state, not in a county or city, but at the federal level. And if that's the case, then these case files and records may not be in the state, they may be at the federal level. And so look for those federal records as well. This is actually a fantastic document. This is a wanted poster from the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division from the Internal Revenue Service, which is federal. This is from the 1920s, and I actually found this on the West Virginia State Archives website. So it's fantastic. It's a picture with the moonshine and the still, and this is from a federal government agency. Here is the Commonwealth of Virginia versus Sam Rawson. This is also a federal case from Rockingham County, Virginia, 1933. This I found these records at the Exploring Rockingham's Past website. Fantastic records. And they were, again, unlawfully have in his possession 4 gallons of ardent spirits. There's some more of that lingo for you, in violation of the Prohibition law. And so you might find these records actually at the federal level. Here is another document from that same case file, and it says it has in its possession 3.5 gallons of ardent spirits. Now, what is interesting to me is that over on the right there, we have the jury. They list the jury by name. And it says, talked about are they guilty? Is he innocent? And they list those jury members, and they list also how much they paid those jury members. So you never know what you're going to find in these loose court records. Next, we're going to talk about oral histories, local histories, or even local lore. Now, this can get kind of sketchy. First of all, trying to find it, but also whether or not it can be believed. Many times we have to take into consideration on some information that we cannot necessarily prove, but it's something that maybe we can work from. Moonshiners and the locations of their stills were often known by the locals. Believe me, I have actually talked to people here locally, because I live in the South. Remember, it's not just a Southern thing, but I do live in the South, that know where stills have been in the past. The locals know. Even if the officials don't know, believe me, the locals know. And so a lot of times local historical societies, genealogical societies, or other historical entities hopefully have done some oral histories with many of the residents in that community. And maybe they have recorded it on film, or maybe they have transcribed those histories and they are available for researchers. We need to interview our own family members. Now, you're told this all the time as a genealogist, to interview your family members, the ones that are still surviving and living, and asking them about stories and things. Well, ask them about what happened locally. Maybe it didn't happen necessarily in your family, but ask them about where they lived, some of the things that happened locally, and might even just kind of throw in there, ask them about moonshining, if they knew about where there were any stills, had they heard any stories about who may have had stills, been arrested, things like that. It's always great to throw questions like that in for our family members. And we also need to look at these repositories, look at these archives to see if we can find these local histories, oral histories. And so research local histories to learn about moonshining activities and stories. Believe me, you probably will be able to find at least one or two stories, maybe not about your ancestor, but about the activity locally. And it just adds a lot of color and excitement to the area where your ancestors may have lived. This is actually a photograph of some of the oral histories that we have in the Houston County, Tennessee Archives and Museum. These oral histories were done by local residents in our county. They were done by our local historical society. They are on CD, but they've actually been transferred over to digital, and they are available on our Patron computer for anyone to come to the archives and sit down and watch any of these oral histories. They talk about themselves growing up, going to school, things that happen in the community. And so these are invaluable to local history. Also, it would be important to talk to local historians, talk to members of the Historical and Genealogical Society members, because they are really knowledgeable. Get the inside scoop or get the stories about moonshining in the area if you feel like that your ancestors may have been part of that. Talk to these people who actually collect and preserve the history, because they probably have seen stories, they've seen probably some news items, maybe they've seen some of the court records, and they can talk to you about whether or not it was prevalent in the area, what areas of the county or the city that it was known to have happened, and then maybe they can help you with your ancestor trying to find some records. Newspapers, those are phenomenal places to find information about moonshining. I don't know why, but it seemed like whenever they busted up a moonshine still or place, the sheriff, the newspaper, they loved to print stories about this kind of stuff. So local newspapers could have reported about your moonshining ancestors. That is a fantastic way to find them, is in the newspaper. We look in the newspaper for all kinds of things as genealogists. We look for obituaries, we look for birth announcements, marriage announcements. Why not look for your ancestors if they got into the moonshining trade? So look for those newspapers. Many times these stories are going to be front page or headline news, especially in a very small community. That's going to be headline news whenever something's happened with moonshining. And so look on the front page and the headline news sections and look to see if you can find any stories. Here's an example of that. This is the Bozeman Courier newspaper from Bozeman, Montana, April the 20th, 1921. This is from Chronicling America. And right there on the front page, it says, "Capture big still and complete outfit in moonshine raid on ranch near Logan." And so then you can read the article, and if this is where your ancestors lived, maybe they were part of it, but maybe their neighbors were part of it, or maybe distant relatives, like lots of different cousins or something. Maybe not your direct ancestors, but maybe some others in the family were part of something like this. So newspapers can actually be fantastic. Also look for those community columns in the newspaper. I like to call them gossip columns. Those ones that talk about that Mr. and Mrs. John Henry went shopping, in the next town over, things like that. But they also may mention some of the happenings with moonshining. These columnists who did these columns like to stir things up. They like to mention people who got into trouble. And so you might look to these community columns to see if they're mentioned. Now, you may have to do a bit of reading if they don't show up in a search on Chronicling America or newspapers.com or some of the other newspaper sites. So you may have to do some reading to find them, but to me, it's fascinating reading. Also, look to those court case and sheriff lists in the newspaper. Many times the newspapers will list whatever sheriff arrests that were happening that week, or whatever court cases were fixing to go to court, they would list those as well. So if you don't know where to look in court cases for your ancestors' court cases, look to the newspapers. They may list when your ancestors' court case would be coming up in court, or they may list if they had been arrested that week. A lot of these newspapers will put those kind of lists in the newspaper. And most importantly, look for these photographs. I think that one of the things I've noticed about moonshining is when they have found a still, they love to take pictures with those stills and other things. So newspapers love to print these photographs as well. I think it drew people to purchase newspapers, which was great for them, but they love to do that. So here's an example of that. Remember on that court document, I pointed out Albert Patterson, the sheriff. Well, this is him. I told you I would show you a picture of him. This is Sheriff Albert Patterson. He was posing with the discovered moonshine still in the 1930s. This is local where I live today. And we have this photograph in the Archives and Museum. Fantastic photograph. Here's another photograph many years later. On the left there is Deputy Owen Beecham, and on the right again is Sheriff Albert Patterson. He's kind of gotten a little bit older, but there's again posing with moonshine evidence. They really like to take those pictures with the stills, with the moonshine jugs, and put it in the newspaper. So these were actually published in the newspaper. Look at all of those moonshine jugs. This photograph was actually taken over by our old jail. We have a new jail now, but this is over by the old jail, and they just love to take those photographs. And for some reason in my archive, I have collected, people will come in and bring me moonshine photographs. So we have a great collection of them. Here's a couple of more photographs. The one on the left is actually from 1959, and the one there on the right is from 1995. So if you think that moonshining was something of the past, I can tell you that they're probably still going on today. And don't ask me, I don't know where any of them are. But this one on the right there is from 1995. So where am I going to find these records that I've told you about? Well, I'm sure you could probably understand that you're not going to go walk into an archives and you're not going to find boxes that are labeled Moonshine Records. So you're going to have to do some digging, and you're going to, like I said, I showed you some records that you can find this information in. So, but don't look for Moonshine Records. You're going to have to look for other records. But most likely there are going to be no indexes titled Moonshine Records. You're going to have to look for those court records, look for those jail records, sheriff records, newspapers, things like that. So accessing the records that are known to have been pertaining to moonshine, like court records, those sheriff records, those oral histories, local histories, and newspapers is your best option. These record sources are one of the best places to find this kind of information about your ancestor. Some records can be found online. I showed you several photographs of newspaper articles. I found all of those online. But you may still have to contact an archive in the area where your ancestors lived, or where they may have gotten into trouble, or where they were caught. Again, remember at the beginning, we talked about all the different kinds of archives. So there may be a county archive, maybe there's a historical society or genealogical society that have collected these types of records. Maybe the local library has some records on this, but any kind of repository in the area that's collecting and preserving records may just have what you're looking for. Court records. Court records can be found at the courthouse. Maybe they're still at the courthouse. Maybe even the old court records are still at the courthouse in those court offices. Now, most likely they've been transferred to some sort of archive, because court offices run out of room and they're still trying to do the work of today. So they need that room. And so I know that many of these court offices transfer their old court records to county archives, historical societies, or maybe just put them in storage. So you may have to find out where those records are located. Look, they could be located at a county archive. Remember, county archives usually take care of county government records, and these court offices are part of county government normally. So I would check with the county archive. They could be microfilmed and available at the local library, the Historical or Genealogical Society. They may be available online. If they've been microfilmed and let's say Family Search has those microfilmed records, maybe they've been digitized and they are available. Maybe the digitized versions or indexes are available. Maybe those are available on the county archive website or the historical or genealogical website. Many times there's volunteers that have sat down and done indexes of these court records. So look to those for those indexes. Maybe even some of the records have been actually digitized and you can actually see them online. Newspapers, where can we find newspapers? Well, we can find them in lots of different places. And so newspapers actually, for the most part, a lot of them have been microfilmed. And today, a lot of these places are trying to get their newspapers digitized as fast as they can. Again, they're going to be available at libraries, historical and genealogical societies. And don't forget those university and college libraries. I have found that they really like to have microfilmed and even digitized newspapers available for researchers. And so anybody pretty much can get on a college or university campus and go to these archives and libraries on those campuses and look for newspapers. Many times newspapers can be found in bound volumes. The actual newspapers are bound together, like one year would be bound into a book form, but it's actually the actual newspapers. We have some of those in our archives. Maybe individual issues of newspapers have been archived and are available. But again, these can be found at any of the archives that I have told you about, and look for those newspapers there. And again, there are several newspaper databases. There's some free newspaper databases like Chronicling America. And then you have the paid databases that you may have to pay something to actually see. Maybe your library has these databases offering it to you with the library card, and you can even access it from home. So look for these newspaper databases. And I would encourage you to not just use the search engine on these databases. I would encourage you to read some of the whole newspapers, either online or in person if you're at an archive, because you never know where some of these stories are going to show up in the newspapers. Now, typically you're going to see moonshine stories on the front page as a headline, but they may not always put it on the front page. So I would encourage you to read the entire newspaper. Now, I do this as a practice because I never know where I'm going to find my ancestors listed. Those little community columns, they stick those kind of anywhere in the newspaper. They don't normally put them on the same page every time. And they may stick a news item that they didn't have room on the front page for on page 6 or page 10. And so it's important for us to actually read more than just the front page. Another place to find newspapers or newspaper clippings is in vertical files. Vertical files are a fantastic collection of records. You may see them referenced as subject files or morgue files. They are in filing cabinets and file folders. They usually are arranged by surname or subject name. The archive should have an index for you, but look for newspaper clippings there. Also, at an archive, look in scrapbooks. A lot of times there are scrapbooks that are filled with nothing but newspaper clippings. And maybe there's some stories in there about moonshining. And so there's another place to find newspapers. Sheriff and jail records. We talked about looking for those. Again, these could still be located at the sheriff or the jail's offices. Again, they may not have moved them anywhere. They may have them in a back room somewhere. And so check with them. But remember, they're doing the business of today. And so you may have to wait. You may have to wait for them to get back to you. You may not be able to walk right into the building because it is a sheriff or a jail office to look at these records, but you may be able to set up a time to go do that. Hopefully these older records have been transferred to a county archive or historical or genealogical society if they exist. I have noticed that some of sheriff and jail records, if they're really old, don't exist because they've been destroyed or they've just not been kept. So check first to make sure that they're available. Also, those state archives, remember we talking at the beginning about state archives? A lot of times local records, if they didn't have an archive or a place for them to be transferred to, a lot of times they were sent to the state archives. So that's, you may find local county records at the state archives because there was no place for them to go. They may be in their original form, original paper form, or they could be microfilmed and at the state archives. And so that's why I encourage genealogists to do their research at state archives. Because like I said, not every area had a county archive or even a historical society or a genealogical society. And so those records needed to go somewhere because they didn't have room for them, and they may have ended up at the state archives. Most importantly, you need to scour the internet. Like I said, there are records coming online fast and furious each and every day. Not everything's online yet, but there's a lot coming online. So look to archived websites, databases, indexes, digital images. A lot of times on these websites that archives put up, they don't make it very easy for you to find things. I don't know what it is about archivists, and I am one, why we make it so hard for genealogists to find things. So when you get on a website, you need to dig down into that website. You need to peel it like an onion, click on everything. There's more on that website than what you can see just on the landing page. So click on everything, and I bet you'll be surprised at what you can find there. Oral histories. Now, oral histories are going to be one of the harder things to find, because in order for oral history to have survived, someone had to have actually interviewed someone to get the oral history. And hopefully you have, like we have CDs and DVDs and digital film of people we've gotten oral histories from. But a lot of times these oral histories were done before that equipment was around. And so you may find that it was transcribed, written, handwritten, typewritten, and you may find these in archives. So look for those oral histories, because while they may not be 100% proof that something happened, at least it's something to go on. It's kind of like those online family trees. I use them, but I use them as a guide. I don't believe everything that's on them, but I use them as a guide to help me find the documentation and the proof that I need. Many residents may have written down their memories and their stories in diaries, journals, and scrapbooks. These can also be found in archives. Usually they're found in manuscript collections, but diaries, journals, and scrapbooks, this is where people wrote down what they saw, what they heard, the stories that they heard, and they may have talked about moonshining in the area, and maybe they mentioned your ancestor, who knows? So talk to the archivist about some of their diaries, journals, and scrapbooks. Let them know you're looking for some stories, some history about your ancestors, whether they were into moonshining or not. And I would read the neighbors' diaries, journals, and scrapbooks and see if they mention your ancestor. Also look to those published history books. Now, again, they're not foolproof. They're not 100% correct, but they may give you enough information to go on to look for court records, jail records, and things like that. So don't discount those published history books because they're not 100% accurate. Take the information you find in them, work with it to find the documentation. The main thing is to tell the stories. Whether it's a moonshining story or some other story in your ancestor's life, it's important that we as genealogists document their stories, tell their stories, because, you know, they say that it only takes a couple of generations for our family stories to absolutely disappear. That's why sometimes when I find out a story and I ask my family members about it, they're like, well, I don't know anything about that, because it's not been told, it's not been passed down. And so we as genealogists should do that. We should be telling our ancestors' story, which will also keep them alive, but bring them to life, to me and to you. I like to work with my ancestors, their documentation, their stories. And the more I get to know about them, the more I want to know about them. And so that's why I like to do what I do. So if you think your ancestor was too old to be into moonshining, how about this one? Octogenarians moonshining. J.R. Knight and C.P. Killian were nearly 100 years old, and E.E. Page was well over 70 years old. And then also Mrs. Knight and Lula Page, this is from July the 7th, 1920. They were into moonshining. This is from the Chattanooga News, and I found it again on Chronic America, a free newspaper website. But if you think your ancestors were too old to do a lot of things, they probably weren't. And so don't just count the fact that they may have done some things in their later years. So thank you very much for attending this presentation. I hope that it encourages to not only look for your moonshining ancestors, but to just get out there and find the stories about your ancestors. Visit my blog, A Genealogist in the Archives. There is the website, and also it's on the handout. And also find me on Facebook. Just search for The Archive Lady and like my page. If you have any questions at all about finding your moonshining ancestors, researching in archives, please contact me. There's my email address. And again, the email address will be on the handout. And thank you very much for attending this presentation.